Welcome to our new season, Innate, How Science Invented the Myth of Race. This is Episode 5, Part 2, The African Burial Ground. Before we start, a content warning for our listeners. This episode contains details about violence and the mishandling of human remains. This is the second part of a two-part episode, so if you haven't listened to Part 1 yet, you should. In that episode, we heard about how the remains of Black children killed by the Philadelphia police in the 1985 MOVE bombing had been stored inside the Penn Museum for decades, without any family knowledge or consent.
One of the saddest days in Philadelphia history is right back in the spotlight. But the focus tonight is on the remains of some of the children who were killed in that bombing and how it appears they were used in classes to teach Ivy League students.
This revelation left the children's families and the public outraged and grief-stricken. And then came the salt on the wound. Even though it was clearly unethical, it turned out that no laws or even clear professional standards have been broken. We met bioarchaeologist Michael Blakey at the end of the last episode. He's been leading the charge to rewrite these professional standards, and he's the perfect person to do it because he's been practicing ethical, community-driven archaeology research for decades. In the 1990s, Michael Blakey led the African Burial Ground Archaeology Project in Manhattan.
And in the end, I have to say this, that we produced the most sophisticated bioarchaeological project that has been conducted thus far.
Michael Blakey and his team worked with the consent of the people who had the most at stake, and they involved them in the research. And it wasn't just ethical, it produced better science. Our senior producer, Mariel Carr, reported this two-part episode, and she's going to take part 2 from here.
Thanks, Alexis. I want to start this episode by taking us back to a moment in the fall of 1991. I spoke to a man named Bill Diamond who was also involved in this project, but on the other side of the table from Michael Blakey.
Chapter 1. We found bones.
Okay, this is Bill Diamond speaking. It was during the last year of the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush. I was the regional administrator of the United States General Services Administration for the Northeast United States.
The General Services Administration, or GSA, manages all federal property. And Bill Diamond oversaw the construction of every federal building in his region, which included New York City. In the fall of '91, he'd been managing the construction of a new 34-story office building in Lower Manhattan.
The Congress of the United States had allocated a large sum of money, which you can look up, to build a federal office building right in Foley Square.
The price tag was $275 million. And Bill thought everything was going okay.
I had a no strike clause. It was just going along fine.
But when the crew broke ground, something happened, and Bill Diamond was out of town.
My wife and I were on vacation in Acapulco. And it's very far away. And all of a sudden, who was on the phone but David Dinkins, the mayor of New York? I believe he was the first Black mayor of New York. He says, "We found a skull. We found a skeleton. We found bones."
From Fox 5, this is the 10 o'clock news.
It's a graveyard right in the heart of downtown, and it's already surprising some historians. Jeff Weiser has more in this exclusive report.
And that was the site where the backhoe hit the skeleton of the first discovery. And that's where the so-called problem began.
Days later, an official announcement was made. They'd found 11 intact burials 30 feet below Broadway. When you listen to Bill's story and the TV news, it sounds like construction workers accidentally dug up that first skeleton in the fall of '91. But a woman named Peggy King Yorta told me that's not actually what happened. Peggy King Yorta was living in New York and working in the mayor's office of construction in 1990 when she was approached by a friend, a man who was a groundskeeper at City Hall Park.
And he considered himself a history buff. He was born and raised in New York. He used to drop by and talk to everybody. And so one day he dropped by and he said, Peggy, I'd like to meet you for lunch. Let's bring our lunches and I have something to show you.
He showed Peggy an environmental impact statement. This is a report that GSA had to get done before they broke ground. It was required by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. And these reports show how land was used in the past.
They want to make sure that, it's safe. They also, would like to know whether it's an important site or not.
The final environmental impact statement included documents like a written description of the land from the 18th century and some old maps. Peggy got it right after it was submitted in 1990. Now, just a note, the name African Burial Ground was given to it after it was rediscovered in the 20th century. Maps and other historical documents from its time use a range of outdated terms. So for clarity and consistency, and frankly respect, I'm going to be calling it the African Burial Ground even when I'm talking about it in a historical context.
And on one of the larger maps was this name, the Negroes' Burying Ground. And so he gave me the document. You hold on to it. And please let whoever needs to know, so that we can possibly stop this and that nothing really should be built on this site. This is where people are buried. And that in his mind, there should be a chapel where people can go and reflect what happened there. And so that started a conversation between us over lunch about his reflecting on the fact that he had gone to school in New York City, didn't know anything about this history, was shocked to find that New York had enslaved Africans, that slavery was even part of New York's history, and that he generally assigned that to the South.
And he wasn't alone. Many of us think primarily of the South when we think of American slavery. But New York City was actually once home to the largest community of enslaved Africans outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Africans were first brought to New York City by the Dutch in 1626. They came from Congo, Angola, and some by way of Brazil, where they'd already been enslaved. And they built the infrastructure of New York City and the wealth of its founders. And this burial ground was their sacred space.
Chapter 2. Anybody know any Black archaeologists?
Almost every inch of the land on top of the burial ground had been developed in the 19th and 20th centuries. So it was reasonable to wonder if any burials could still be intact. This is Bill Diamond speaking in a 1994 documentary called An American Discovery, The African Burial Ground.
In the environmental impact statement, which the government is required to do, they turned up a map that showed the existence of the, quote, Negro burial ground. The feeling, however, was, and there were many references to this in the documentation, that while the cemetery had existed, that it was no more in existence.
Even so, the environmental impact statement recommended treading with extreme care.
That document said, even if those burials had been disturbed over the course of the years that the city was developing, that it would still be incredibly important to move cautiously and with the idea that we want to get as much ground truth, as they say, from the ground about a population that we knew so little about, which was first-generation Africans, enslaved Africans, and free Africans in New York.
So the GSA hired an archaeological crew to do some initial digging. They were required to do this by law. And the crew narrowed in on a sliver of land that had always been an alley.
And that was the site where the backhoe hit the skeleton of the first discovery. And that's the one that Dinkins called me on.
Peggy King Yorta heard the news, and she noticed that there was no mention about who exactly had been buried there. And that's when she learned that the GSA had implemented a gag order.
a gag order for the archaeologists not to have a conversation with the public about what they're seeing, really. And I happened to go with an in-house group of city workers to go to the site side. And I remember hearing the archaeologist kind of field some questions. And however he was fielding those questions seemed to be a denial of the existence of these people who were buried there. For me, as a descendant of enslaved people, for me to be standing there and then to have someone on a simple word, essentially in my mind, attempt to erase the very existence of a people laying there in the ground, it just was outrageous to me. And I knew that at that moment, I just could not turn a blind eye. I'm a product of the civil rights movement. My father was a civil rights attorney. So it just sort of sparked within me this desire to investigate more where the resistance was coming from and how do we stop that? You know, how do we change that course?
Peggy was worried that this team of archaeologists, who were all white, by the way, weren't the right fit for the job. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just a site of 20 or 30 burials, that there were probably thousands. So Peggy started writing memos and going to federal meetings she hadn't been invited to. And one stands out.
In that meeting, they were giving an update on some of the information that they thought that they were uncovering in the field.
In one gravesite, they found a button from a British naval coat. And one of the archaeologists suggested that maybe this man had stolen it from a British officer.
Why would he say that? You know, historically, we know that the British offered freedom to those enslaved Africans if they fought with them. Okay, so now he's starting to write a new story again. And it became my mission to raise that issue, which is to say, why don't you have someone who is a Black professional, an archaeologist, a historian? Where are your African-American professionals on this team? It seems to me that we all agree that our story was written by other people who don't look like us. And now that the ground is open again, here's an opportunity for us to be able to interpret our own story. Now is an opportunity to do this right. And at that point, after raising it, I will never forget the general administrator, Bill Diamond, looked to the left, looked to the right and said, anybody know any Black archaeologists? You know? And I said, well, if you don't know them, I'll help find them.
And she did. She found Michael Blakey, but she needed a strong showing of public support to get him hired.
Chapter 3. Some of them bones is mine.
In 1990, just a year before the burial ground first made TV news, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, had become law. NAGPRA protects Native American cultural objects and human remains, and it lays out procedures to repatriate them to lineal descendants and affiliated tribes.
GSA knew that if they encountered something like that, that the response by the federal government would be to step back from a site like that. But there were no such laws for African-American sites. This was not something that they were going to move forward on with the idea that, you know, hey, let's stop and talk to everybody and figure out whether we're actually going to build this building or not. That's not the way it was going to be approached at all.
But the 1966 National Historic Preservation Act gave the burial ground some protection, namely Section 106, which says that the responsible federal agency must consult with members of the public and consider their views and concerns when making final project decisions.
And so it was really important. We demanded public meetings. They expected only a few people, and it continued to grow.
Bill Diamond met with the public like he was crossing a task off a list. But meanwhile, he was still trying to excavate the burial ground so he could get his building up.
You know, you have a multi-million-dollar building that you have a top architecture firm design, it's for you, it's going up. I mean, they don't want to hear, hey, stop the building.
But that's exactly what he heard in meetings that kept getting bigger. They started out in conference rooms, but eventually filled up whole churches. And Michael Blakey was at most of those meetings.
They were all powerful and tended to be quite large on the streets around the building and the churches.
You do not disturb the deceased. You leave our people alone. You let them rest in peace. And if these reasonable and just demands are not met, then at the very least, we should do everything that we can to stop the construction of this building.
That community in New York was galvanized. This was about respect, not just for the dead, but for the living. And the mundane racism, the disrespect for African American dignity that white people, principally of the federal government, were expressing. I testified on the Hill about this as well, in the marvelous company of people like Mayor David Dinkins and David Patterson, and just everyday folks who all knew what they were and would not be treated as less.
They recognized the people in the burial ground as their ancestors. The institution of slavery might have erased people's names and broken family ties, and it might not be possible to prove blood relationships, but they saw themselves as family nonetheless.
There is a slogan that seems to be going around the community right now that is borrowed from an old Negro spiritual, which says, "Some of them bones is my mother's bones come together for to rise and shine. Some of them bones is my father's bones, and some of them bones is mine." So there is a sense of a very, very personal connection that our community has with the African burial ground that goes deeper than all of the politics that are coming out of this issue, because this is about family.
Stop the digging. And what happened was that it became a tremendous political issue. Crowds came, they blamed me, and crowds came down from wherever, all over the city, I think, yelling, "Fire Bill Diamond, fire Bill Diamond." As a Republican political appointee, I was under real pressure.
Bill Diamond proposed a way to honor the burial ground, but community organizers found it disrespectful.
How will the government then acknowledge the fact that this was a cemetery?
The region has been able to come with a $250,000 contribution to interpretive display, which we will do. It is not it's obviously not a pacifier.
Meeting after meeting after meeting, you have led us on, you have made us think that you were listening to us, and yet you have not. For you to sit there and to tell us about a plaque in a building is not addressing the situation at all. Why are you meeting with the community?
Because we meet does not mean that we agree.
Bill Diamond is now retired. But 3 decades later, this experience has stuck with him.
They set up a site of worship. People came and gave food to the skeletons. There were a number of practitioners of African religions, and they said prayers. There was one who kept threatening me with his, what do they call that stick? Juju stick. And he said, "If I put this stick on you, you will be cursed forever." And I'm basically Jewish, so I didn't want to take the chance. And he was right, because he had the moral force of his deep feelings for his people, and whose gravesite was being disturbed.
Bill Diamond told the public that he was bringing their demands to his superiors, but later in a congressional hearing, he admitted that he never did. In 1992, he communicated the GSA's final position to the public.
We have been instructed by the Congress, we being the General Services Administration, by law to construct an 850,000 square foot building on this site. We have no alternative but to do so, unless we are instructed by the Congress not to do so.
And in the summer of 1992, this is what finally happened. Congressman Gus Savage of Chicago, a member of the Congressional Black Caucus and chairman of the House of Representatives Subcommittee on Buildings and Grounds, threw in his support for the community activists. And that made the difference.
I am not going to be a party of your disrespecting what people here have testified, scholars have called, the most important archaeological discovery in this century. But I'm going to do, Gus Savage, everything in my power to make you change your obstinacy and your disrespect for a sector of this city. And with that having been said,
Chapter 4. We are the memorializers.
The group of community organizers had won. They were in charge. And Peggy King-Yorta gave them this message.
You need Dr. Blakey to be on that team. You need the constituency to get behind getting this man on the team. And so those guys would show up at meetings and they were armed with, we need Dr. Blakey to be on this team.
So Michael Blakey was brought on to work alongside the GSA hired archaeology team for 10 days to evaluate whether they were cut out for the job or not.
And my evaluation was essentially that they were ill-equipped to analyze what was clearly becoming the largest and most important African-American bioarchaeological site, maybe the earliest. The short answer is that the principal investigator who I knew, he had a high school diploma. He was white, but he had a high school diploma. I had a team of PhDs who with long experience on African-American, and increasingly we saw we needed Africanists and Caribbeanists with PhDs. They wanted to, for example, use race as a fundamental way of understanding the African burial ground population. Africans from many societies, kingdoms, and empires in West and West Central Africa, all of which had specific histories and the specific history of their being brought into the Caribbean and then into New York and the lives they lived there. Well, this is about their history and biology, understanding health, nutrition, mortality, fertility. It's one line of evidence. And as we did in our project, among buried lines of evidence, historical and other evidence, to characterize the human lives of these people. Race objectifies them.
The GSA archaeologists were forensic anthropologists. Their expertise was in identifying people for the courts, and they had a very narrow focus. This is how Fatima Jackson, a biologist and anthropologist who also worked on the project, puts it.
They wanted to do, race, age, gender, race, age, gender, race, age, gender. Like, we know this is a dude, and he's probably African American. They're in the Negro burial ground. Hint, hint,
This is another clip from that 1994 documentary of one of those original archaeologists.
We determine racial characteristics by looking at various differences that are apparent, usually in the cranium, in the skull of an individual. There are certain characteristics which indicate or suggest that people were of African ancestry or Caucasian or Oriental or whatever. Out of the total population that we've looked at so far, by far the majority seem to be of African ancestry.
Besides the narrow scope, it was also clear that the excavation was being rushed. The team was working 11 hours a day, 7 days a week. And when Michael Blakey surveyed the storage area, he found skeletal remains crammed into cabinet drawers, damaged skulls and broken bones. And the storage area had no air conditioning, which meant that mold had started growing on the remains. And the team was so busy excavating, they hadn't produced a research design. There was no line of inquiry they were pursuing, no broad questions they were trying to answer. They were just digging up bodies as quickly as they could so that GSA could get on with the building. So Michael Blakey and his team took over, but they were working for that group of community organizers. They were the people who had taken ownership over this burial ground, who saw the people there as their ancestors. And Michael coined a new term to describe this group. He called them the descendant community.
I was working on a research design, thinking this community needs a handle. What would they be called that embodies their rights, their specific rights to the past and to their ancestors, what its relationship was, what the justification of its stewardship of the remains was. And that fit was embraced by the community then and continues to be used.
The descendant community was concerned about the continued desecration of the burial ground. They recognized that rituals around death are a vital part of our humanity. And Michael Blakey did too.
What does it mean to be human? What would be on the final exam of an introductory course? And of course, we characterize human beings as those who walk on two legs, erect, have their hands free and opposable, develop tools. We transform energy as fire. But what occurs, what marks the earliest Homo sapiens is the burial of the dead. Ultimately, it is to imagine the continuing social obligations of human beings, even to the dead. I sometimes think that we should be called Homo reminiscens, not sapiens, that what distinguishes us is that we are the memorializers.
The descendant community had decision-making power.
And key in this, the community could have refused our access completely. You can only consent when you can refuse. And so they had the potential to refuse us. And they could use then the practitioners that most human beings have used for a millennia, religious practitioners, to memorialize their dead. But as a lifelong scientist, I also felt that we had skills to offer to help tell an accurate story, a material-based story of the dead.
In the end, the descendant community gave permission to Michael Blakey and his team to study the remains that had already been excavated. There were 419 of them. The total number of burials was estimated to be much higher, maybe 20,000. But the descendant community said, that's enough. We want to leave the rest in peace. But it was this group, the descendant community, not just Michael Blakey and his team, who came up with research questions. They wanted the experts to answer the questions that were important to them.
Chapter 5. The neutral scholar is an ignoble man.
We considered the descendant community to be our ethical client.
Michael Blakey calls this a clientage model, and it meant that the expert team was beholden to the descendant community. It put the power in their hands. And that didn't stop at just getting permission. It meant the descendant community got regular updates on the project. They had access to lab visits, and they got to decide on the research questions.
Since we are always making decisions involving people's history, and that has impact on their lives, they have a right to be involved in those decisions. In other words, I agree with Frederick Douglass in 1854, who says, the neutral scholar is an ignoble man, simply looking for a way of covering his personal decisions so that he can, get the support of everybody. He said on slavery, he said, you are either for us or against us. So I'm essentially for the humane responsibility of scholars to do no harm. And it is possible to do harm with the telling of other people's stories, certainly with preventing them from telling their own.
The descendant community narrowed in on 4 questions.
Origins of the African community in New York, transformations towards the beginning of an African American population or community, the physical quality of life during their enslavement, and then the 4th is resistance.
One burial still stands out to Michael.
There's one example of a silver ear bob that a child had worn that was placed around a child's neck as a pendant by people who were desperately poor as the enslaved of New York. They gave that to that child.
You can hear these questions and the stories that Michael's telling and say that's nice or touching. But the approach also made for much more sophisticated archaeology. Michael wasn't just checking boxes off of a list. He wasn't identifying race, age, gender, and moving to the next burial. He was trying to paint a picture of these people's lives. This is Fatima Jackson again.
You know, at the time that Michael Blakey was directing the New York African Burial Ground, he was bucking the establishment, the scientific establishment, because they wanted to do, race, age, gender, race, age, gender, race, age, gender. It's like, that's not what we want to know. So our questions were at a higher level than the typical forensic question. And so he really shifted the paradigm. And now you see at other grave sites that have been discovered, people aren't talking about race, age, gender anymore. They're talking about the Blakey approach. In fact, we should call it the Blakey approach in archaeology. But that was a tremendous battle.
The final archaeology reports are thousands of pages long, and they're all about answering those 4 questions. But here's just one example of a way that Michael Blakey was able to start chipping away at that question about origins.
Burial 101 has evidence of a tropical disease, very slightly filed teeth, which is something usually not continued in the Americas. And he either was born in the Americas or in a highly Europeanized, say, Creole community in a place like Ghana.
There was also this notable design made from tacks on the lid of this man's coffin, sort of in the shape of a heart.
Could be a number of things, but it depends on what eyes one brings to it.
Michael Blakey and his team suggested that it could be a Sankofa symbol from the Akan tribe in Ghana.
That means, look to the past to inform the present and as a guide to the future. I will say that in our reports, we indicate that there are several possibilities. We don't absolutely know. We don't absolutely know anything about the past. But Sankofa was embraced by us all.
A Sankofa became the symbol of the African burial ground. It now graces the national monument. Choosing this symbol felt powerful and relevant.
Remember, in the 1990s, we were in a kind of regime of, let's just move on. I'll tell you, if someone says, as GSA occasionally said to me, let's not talk about what just happened to you. Let's just start from here. They're trying to get away with something.
Years later, a historian named Eric Seaman questioned whether this heart-shaped symbol could really be a Sankofa. He wrote about it in an article in 2010.
Timed with the opening of our visitor center, that essentially says, this symbol cannot be Sankofa because no European had seen it, because there's no record of it in a European archive in this period of the late 18th century. That's a kind of historical conceit, that only if white people write about it does it exist objectively.
Michael says that denying the possibility that this symbol was a Sankofa feeds into a narrative that African culture did not persist in the Americas.
There's often the assumption that they were readily acculturated, it's in the narrative of a Christian charity that slavery gave to the enslaved more than what he or she had as Africans.
In his article, Eric Seaman points to some Adinkra cloths in a Dutch museum as part of his case against the Sankofa symbol in the African burial ground.
Seaman says there were many stampings, but none was Sankofa.
So Michael went to look for himself, and he found something else entirely.
And in the very center of that Adinkra cloth are, in a whole panel, is the classic form of Sankofa. So either it was dishonest or a reflection of the inability to recognize what one sees when it is not what one wishes to see. To be purported, really, to undermine, I think, the African-American-led project and scholars as somehow biased and not legitimate in assessing the evidential past of our own people.
The next step of the project was DNA analysis of the remains, and the descendant community pushed for this to happen at Howard, a historically Black university. So in November of 1993, Howard University hosted a ceremony to honor the ancestors of the African burial ground. And after the ceremony, the remains would go on to Howard's William Montague Cobb lab.
We pour libation on Mother Earth to
call on the Almighty Supreme Being for generations to come.
There was a procession to Howard's chapel, and once there, an elder from the New York descendant community handed Michael Blakey a box carefully wrapped in an African cloth.
It was powerful. I still have that box. We wanted to commemorate what these remains meant to us in our communities, the complementarity of science and spirituality of Africa and the diaspora around our received remains.
Chapter 6. What can you do with 400 years of African American biological history?
We're able to mine so much information out of the New York African Burial Ground. In fact, I wrote a paper many years ago, and it said, what can you do with 400 years of African American biological history? And the answer is a lot.
This is Fatima Jackson again. Until recently, she was the director of the William Montague Cobb Lab at Howard, and she still teaches there. Fatima joined the African Burial Ground Project in 1994, but she didn't get access to DNA samples until 2000.
We had to wait for the genetics because the histologists wanted their piece and the anatomists wanted their piece. And by the time they finally sent some samples, there were some little baby rib bones. And there's very little DNA content in that. But fortunately, the science has progressed.
You can now do sophisticated DNA analysis with tiny samples, which is what Fatima and her lab have. Remember, the descendant community wanted to disturb the remains as little as possible.
But we make do. And we make do, which is the story of our people in America. We make do, and we do the best with what we have. Necessity is the mother of invention.
Fortunately, Fatima was allowed to keep the samples she got, and she's still analyzing them. She's been looking at the mitochondrial DNA. That's DNA that's passed down from our mothers. And she's helping answer that first question about origins in Africa. You see, there's often an assumption that enslaved Africans in the United States came almost exclusively from West and Central Africa. But Fatima has discovered that it's much more complex than that.
Just to give you a hint, because I was working on this analysis this morning, we're finding that the maternal lineages of African Americans come from all over Africa. From East Africa, from West Africa, from Central Africa, the majority for sure, from West and Central Africa, but also from Southern Africa and from Eastern Africa and from North Africa.
At one point, Fatima had a revelation. It was really hard to get access to bones from the burial ground. But then she realized there was another kind of sample that she could study.
The grave soil that was around the bodies, actually it was the bodies at one time before it turned into soil.
So she started working on it with a grad student she had at the time, Carter Clinton. He's now continuing the work as a postdoc at Penn State University.
And he has been able to reconstruct the most likely cause of death for those individuals in the African burial ground 400 years ago. Isn't it exciting?
What? Can you please? Okay, so how is that possible?
The flesh does turn to soil. As we decompose, the microbes in the soil, as well as microbes in our intestine or in other parts of our body, will begin to break down the complex tissues to more simple tissues. So that's really pretty exciting.
Some of the diseases they've identified are tuberculosis, Legionella, which is the cause of Legionnaire's disease, and Yersinia pestis, which is the bubonic plague. And all of this they're finding out from the soil.
So we're also thinking that because the actual time of death for the individuals in the New York African Burial Ground is not known, we can go back and look in the historical record and see what were the epidemics at that time. And then see, do we get a peak in deaths due to yellow fever or due to cholera? And can we match up the cause of death with any historical information on the epidemics of the period? That would be the next step.
Using grave soil instead of bone means that you can kind of have it both ways. You can generate new scientific knowledge without sacrificing someone's bodily autonomy or taking away family members' right to decide how to honor their loved one. It's possible to do ethical science with human remains.
So it's very exciting. It opens up a whole new chapter and says that we don't have to destroy bone in order to get that kind of genomic information. We can actually use the additional information that's all around us. And of course, we're more microbe than we are human DNA.
Fatima Jackson wants to make sure that ethical research continues because we need that new scientific information.
We do know more about Neanderthals than we know about modern humans in Africa. What I'm hoping is that as a people, we will take full advantage of these skeletal and dental remains such that those remains can help us in the future. And they won't just simply be tucked away and forgotten and be of no good to the living. Because the way you put blessings on those who have passed is that you use their efforts to help improve the future.
The African burial ground has had a huge impact on the descendant community.
It's important for us to know as African people what role we played in the structuring of this country and this city. And it's important for other people to know who also feel that blacks have not contributed to anything. It's important for us to know for self-esteem and also for self-respect. I will never walk down these streets the same way again. I'll always know that this is Little Africa. This is where my people lived when we were first brought here in bondage.
The full archaeology reports, which are 2,500 pages long, are now on the GSA's website.
And so it is out there, and I say to people, so read it and do what we've had to do along the way. Put it on the table and compare it with anything else. An activist science can be better science.
Within the field of anthropology, though, the lessons learned from the African burial ground didn't reshape the field as much as Michael Blakey would have hoped. And the discovery of the Move remains at the Penn Museum in 2021 was a harsh reminder of that.
I would like to say, though, that this event has stirred my colleagues. I'm happy that its time has finally come. It's long overdue. But ethics is about our responsibility to other people. And informed consent is at the heart of it. Others have a right to decline, as the family of Tree and Delisha, Africa, should have had the right to really bury their children and decline their display in an online forensics course.
It's frustrating, to say the least, to think that there was this example just sitting there, showing anthropologists of a better way to work. And I asked Michael Blakey why it's kind of been ignored.
We are just a microcosm of the larger society. So I guess the larger way of putting this is it's a problem of whiteness and control and cover. They want the cover and they want the control. You're asking, why hasn't it been embraced? And I'm saying that the teacher's generation of white people rejected it because it was Black-led, because it was not theirs, because they could not have it. But, you know, they say the truth rises, and here it comes.
This episode was reported and produced by me, Marielle Carr. There was additional reporting by Alexis Pedrick, and it was edited by Rigoberto Hernandez. It was mixed by Jonathan Pfeffer, who also composed our innate theme music. Distillations is more than a podcast. It's also a multimedia magazine. You can find our videos, stories, and podcasts at distillations.org. You can follow the Science History Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for news about our podcasts and everything else going on in our museum, library, and research center. The Science History Institute remains committed to revealing the role of science in our world. Please support our efforts at sciencehistory.org/givenow. For Distillations, I'm Marielle Carr.